Welcome into this Five Clubs conversation. I'm Gary Williams. For months and months and months, people were anticipating the book. It's this book titled Gambler. Why? Because there are chapters in this book devoted to the guy who authored this book with his relationship with Phil Mickelson. Now, Billy Walters authored the book, but who really wrote it? Well, the guy who wrote it is Armen Keteyian. He's won countless Emmy Awards. He's been a correspondent for 60 Minutes. He's been on the sideline of NFL games for CBS, but he's also written a lot of really interesting books investigating the world of sports. He investigated the life of Billy Walters, helped construct this book, which could be the adaptation of a screenplay into the life of somebody who's lived his entire life really at risk. My conversation with Armen Keteyian starts now.
I think this is only a grip.
It's only my sole connection to this.
It's only in my hands on every single shot.
It's an extra 2 yards of carry when it matters most.
Yeah, only a grip.
Mine are only golf pride.
Respect the grip.
And with that, we welcome in the man who collaborated on this book. He is, as I said, Armen Keteyian. Good morning. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, Gary. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. You know, you have written books, including one about arguably the most significant historical figure in the history of golf, Tiger Woods. So part of this book obviously centers on a subject matter which is central to what I do on an everyday basis, which is cover golf. But this is such an expansive read about an extraordinary American life. I want to ask you, as somebody who's covered sports for decades and decades, how familiar were you with Billy Walters' life before you started this project?
Well, it's interesting. My first intersection with Billy, I was at Sports Illustrated as a writer reporter in the mid-'80s. In 1986, in March of 86, we produced this 32-page special report called Gambling in America, America's national pastime. One of the stories in that report was on the computer group. And I still, to this day, have that file. It's a fading gray file that says computer group on it. And inside there were all the requests for search warrants that were used across the country when the FBI did all these raids in 1985 on the computer group, and Billy Walters' name is all over that file. He was moving the money for the computer group at the time. His betting operation was raided. So in June of 2020, I got a call from a mutual friend, somebody I had worked with on various other stories. He was on the crisis communication side. He was representing Bill, Glenn Bunting, and Glenn said to me, "Do you know Billy Walters?" And I was like, "The computer group Billy Walters?" I said, "I don't know him. I know of him. I know his reputation." I said, "Well, he'd be interested in talking to you because he's going to write his autobiography, and we think you're the right person to do it." So Billy and I, in June of 2020, we spoke a couple times on the phone. I went out to California and met him. I wrote a couple sample chapters based on a previous manuscript that had been produced and that stopped in 2006. Billy liked what I wrote. And so in September of 2020, we got to work. And we didn't finish. I thought it was going to take about a year. But then when I began to understand the scope and the depth and the controversy and the complications in Billy's life and this larger than life experience that he's been living for now 77 years, I was like, well, this is going to be a little bit longer than a year. And it actually took us, I was still making tiny little edits in this manuscript or in the book that was at the typesetter at the time in June of this year. But the hard work was really done in March, and it was almost 3 years of my life, and 3 years of Bill's life. And I did the math this week, and I was like, 3 years times 50 hours a week times 50 weeks a year, blah, blah, blah. Oh, like 7,000 hours. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of hours. But that's what it took, because as you said, he has lived a uniquely American life. I think he's like an American original. I don't think there are many other Billy Walters out there. The way that his life, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, has laid out all the ups and downs, all the success. You don't beat the books for 36 straight years. You're not recognized as the greatest sports bettor of all time as Jack Binion so wisely said, if there's a Mount Rushmore of sports betting, there's only one face on it, and that face is Billy Walters. There's no one else that's even close. And I've never heard that come out of anybody's mouth before.
It's there's so much in here, and like I said, obviously there are a lot of people who are going to watch and listen to this who have an affinity for the game of golf, and certainly people are curious about what he was going to write about his relationship with Phil Mickelson, but also like he spent his life playing golf for stakes that at the time, late 70s, early 80s, were for more money than that they were playing for on the PGA Tour on a week-to-week basis. So there's plenty to get to, but I want to start with something that he wrote in the prologue of the book. Part of the reason why I was interested in how this book was going to be presented was there anger, was there vengeance, was there this sense of I need to get back at people, because one of the last chapters of his life, and hopefully he lives many, many years beyond present day, the man was incarcerated after he turned the age of 70. But his first reason that he wrote in the prologue as to why he wanted to write this book was to give hope for those suffering with addiction, that he believed his story could help people. I'm in recovery myself as an alcoholic. There's a phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous, attraction rather than promotion. And I am certainly not one to talk about what people should and shouldn't do. I just try to hopefully do certainly the right things on a day-to-day basis. When he shared that with you, did you think to yourself, with any ounce of cynicism in your mind or heart, like, really? And after hearing that and then going through this entire exercise, do you feel like he fulfilled that promise?
That's very good points all the way around. So let me start with sort of the bigger picture that you brought up in relation to Phil. Was there going to be score settling? Was this a revenge tour for Bill? And, part of the reason that it took so long was there's a process. And, when writing books like this, you have to, that's one of the reasons I transcribed every single word that Bill said in every single interview I did. And I did 60 other interviews beyond the hundreds of hours I spent with Bill, was to get an understanding of his voice and his point of view and what kind of man is he. And we had these conversations, and in the edits, we stripped out a lot of the score settling. And I said, Bill, it just doesn't sound right to be, to get too personal here. So that was part of it. That was just part of the process. As far as his motivation, I didn't really know in the beginning why he wanted to write a book. And that's really important. And it's one of the reasons it's so high up in the book, because we wanted people to know. And, Bill was a gambling addict with a capital A. He was a hardcore drinker, probably right on the edge of being an alcoholic, if not an alcoholic, for the first 40 plus 2 years of his life, starting at a very early age. So by the time I got to know Bill Walters and saw what he has done for other people, the bullshit quotient kind of went away. I believe that Billy's head was in the right place, that he does want to help people, because in the end, some of the best reviews I've read so far have been by people that don't care about golf. they don't care about sports gambling, but they're inspired by Bill's story. Because in the end, ultimately, it is really inspiring. And that, for me as a writer, was really the major attraction. Yes, I know what's going on in the world of sports gambling. I love the game of golf. I play the game of golf. Obviously, what Jeff Benedict and I did with Tiger, I understand high stakes gambling. But for me, there was a moment when Bill's lawyer sent me all the letters that were written to Judge Castell in the Southern District of New York prior to Bill's sentencing. And yes, there were letters from David Faraday, and Peter Jacobson, and people that Bill has known for a long time in this world, and even Harry Reid, the late Senator Harry Reid. The ones that caught my attention were the ones that were written by employees of the Walters companies that had worked for Bill for more than 20 years. Oh, when my mother passed away, I didn't have enough money to go to Mexico to give her a proper burial. Well, what did Bill do? He quietly, anonymously paid for the trip and the travel and all of that. When another employee's son was injured and the hospital bills were mounting, what did Bill do? Bill paid the hospital bills anonymously and quietly. He's done more philanthropy in Las Vegas, arguably, than almost anybody else in that city over the last 25 or 30 years. So, yes, was I skeptical in the beginning? Absolutely. What was the motivation, just to get his name out there and kind of take a victory lap? I mean, Bill's got an ego like all of us do, but I didn't feel like his ego overwhelmed me, and it doesn't overwhelm the book. I think in the end, where he says, you know, when you meet your maker, it's like, well, what have you done? What have you given during the course of your lifetime? And I think, as you've read the book, you know that he's, I think, as I say, the risks of Bill's life, and there have been enormous risks at times, have been far outweighed by the rewards of Bill's life. And I think there's something to that when you're looking at it as a reader and also somebody wanting to be a better person. Because, you know, Bill will be the first to admit, for a long time early in his life, he was not a very good person, not a great father, not a great husband. But he's willing to, and I think that's one of the pieces of the book that's as powerful as anything else, is Bill's willingness to admit his faults. A lot of people don't like to do that. They certainly like to do it publicly, to the level that Bill's done it. So yes, long-winded way of saying I was very concerned and conscious of it, but in the end, he won me over, and by his actions, not by so much his words.
Yeah, I was going to ask if, as somebody who has done a lot of vetting of people that you have spent time with, where you have to go back and corroborate, as an elite investigative journalist for as long as you've been doing this, I wonder, did you find him easily believable from the outset? Not like believable after going back and corroborating, like a good con was believable. Did you find him believable? Like sitting down going, wow, this guy, there's an authenticity to him that's like palpable.
Well, that's the word, the authenticity, because I can smell bullshit. I've heard enough of it, and you've heard enough of it over the course of your career and my career, when somebody's just laying it down in a big way, and you're like, really? Okay, this isn't going to be too hard to corroborate, because you're not going to be able to corroborate. But some of Bill's stories really were so crazy that you're like, this can't be true. I mean, he didn't, this bird on the wire story, and he's down $4,000 and he's only got two, and he's betting on which way a bird is going to fly off a wire, east or west. And sure as, night follows day, I call the guy who was in the room, and he goes, oh yeah, no, that's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And the golf stories, somebody should do a movie just about the Professional Gamblers Invitational. I mean,
totally.
There was every hustler and con man and, guys that could play for a lot of money showed up in Vegas for that week-long tournament. But that was I think that's one of the reasons Bill wanted me as his co-writer, because I would bring that kind of rigor to the book. And he would tell me, I mean, I can't tell you how many times he called me, and he would go, okay, call Dewey Tonko, call Bobby Baldwin, call Jack Binion. They'll be able to corroborate what I just told you, because he wanted that he wanted that solidity to the book, that foundation to the book. And it was fun to talk to those guys because one rounder after another, one great storyteller after another. You know, I got to spend time with Doyle Brunson before he passed away. I got to spend time with, Dewey Tomko, Bobby Baldwin, Billy Baxter, just this murderer's row of the best poker players and gamblers in the history of gambling. And one after another, like, oh, no, that's what happened. Yeah, no. But let me tell you something else. And then, you know, you get a little more. So the story would be richer. And I could go back and forth with the conversations that were taking place. But, yeah, I mean, was he the most successful used car salesman in the history of the state of Kentucky at the age of 19? He was. Yeah. Did he make $56,000 in commissions that year? The equivalent of $500,000 in today's dollars? Yes, because I went back and Googled it as like, how much is $56,000 in 2022 dollars? Oh, it's $550,000. Oh, okay. It's just Bill has lived, I think Bill's lived about 6 or 7 lives. You know, he's 77, and you can look at how these chapters kind of lay out, and you can say, oh, the first 4 chapters is one life. The next 4 chapters or 5 chapters is another life. And then you just kind of go, oh, he went to prison when he was 71 years old on insider trading charges, and he spent 31 months in prison on charges to this day. To the day he dies, he'll say he never gave anybody inside information. So, yeah, it was a challenge, but it was a, coming off of the Tiger book, another high wire act. You don't want to fall from that wire because you're going to splat that'll be the end of your journalism career. You screw that one up. So, yeah, no, this was if I was going to get tested, this was a good one to be put to the test.
He also says before we embark on this relationship with Phil Mickelson, that he states that he thinks you learn more from sinners than saints. As somebody who has spent a lot of time talking with both parties, do you share that feeling?
I did. You know, when I wrote that, I was like, it kind of came to me in a rush. You know, one of those things you're like, sinners and saints. Because Susan's a saint. His wife, a complete saint with a capital S. You know, you're married to Billy Walters for going on 47 years. You deserve a Medal of Honor, as far as I'm concerned, in a lot of ways. Because he's a demanding individual. That's one of the reasons he's been so successful in his life, is because he sets a very high bar. But I think in the end, when you look at Bill's life, it's full of a lot of mistakes. It's full of a lot of failure. But that failure has been coupled with an almost maniacal drive to be the best, to win, whether it's selling cars or it's the computer group moving money, or it's owning at one point in time 13 golf courses and really building public golf in Vegas. If there's one person that built it, it was Billy Walters, owning or co-owning 22 car dealerships. I don't know how many hours there were in a day for Bill to do all this stuff. And then he's gambling like a madman from just about right now in August through the Final Four, and spending hundreds of hours, every month trying to beat the best bookmakers in the world. So when you're trying to just line all that stuff up, it gets to the point where you're like, okay, he's doing this, but he's doing 4 other things. And he's trying to do this over here too. So yeah, I think the sinners and saints, I kind of like that. I think you can learn more from sinners than saints. I really do, especially sinners who find themselves and change their lives cold turkey. I don't think some of the guys that Billy met in prison would qualify for people I could learn a lot from. But Billy, to his credit, he became a mentor to at least a couple dozen men in prison and helped change their lives too. And I know for a fact that he's, in a couple of instances, he's gotten them jobs. And now with Hope for Prisoners, that this really powerful nonprofit that Billy's involved with now, where men who are convicted felons who come out of prison have done their time. There's a place now, Hope for Prisoners in Las Vegas, where they can go and get training to have second lives, to learn a trade, to learn how to even get a Social Security card, how to be a productive citizen. And who does that? Well, Billy Walters did it. And that's where you go, oh, there's the sinner, but there's also the saint, who's doing things for people that I don't know a lot of people in my life that have done as much as quietly and anonymously and does it not for the notoriety, but to help others than Bill. And I think that's one of the things that is the heartbeat of the book, is there's a goodness to Bill that I think in the end, as you take this 77-year journey with him, in the end, you're like, wow, that's some kind of man right there. And that's how I felt, at the end.
Armen, the collaboration you did with Jeff on the Tiger book was examining one of the most extraordinary falls from grace in the history of not just American sports, the global sports landscape, his cultural relevancy. And now we have Phil Mickelson, who, along with Tiger, the two most successful and significant figures in the game of golf, really since Jack and Arnold Palmer. And that goes back to Arnold won his last tournament in 1973. We're talking about, 50 years. So Phil and his relationship with Billy, this is also another extraordinary fall from grace, circumstances being different. And a lot of people are going, okay, now we're going to really get the good stuff. The Phil book by Alan Shipnuck had some stuff in it. Yeah, okay, but now this is going to peel back even more layers. When you started to talk about Phil with Billy Walters, were you surprised that he said, the personal stuff, I'll leave that for others. I'm going to focus exclusively on this. Yeah, we had a personal relationship, but we also had a professional partnership. Were you surprised that he didn't, take off both gloves and go in on the personal stuff?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because that just didn't happen at the beginning. It was a process. I think it's fair to say Bill was really upset at Phil, really upset for him. Bill's a man of his word. When he says something to you, you can take it to the bank. I think the cardinal sin for Phil was telling Bill that he would testify or make a public statement that in support of Bill, when Bill's life was on the line, that Bill had never provided any material, non-public information, any inside information on any stock to Phil Mickelson, which Phil had done on two separate occasions in August of 2013 to the FBI agents that were interviewing him, that had interviewed him. So I understand. I've seen Phil a number of different times, particularly when we were covering Tiger. He and Ricky were the only two that ever stood out for extraordinary lengths of time and signed autographs after a practice round or after a pro-am. And I was like, and I've been around Phil because I talked to him about Tiger at various times. I find him to be a very complicated person. The personal side and the professional side. And when you see the scope of his self-admitted addiction to gambling, and that is chronicled to a degree in the book. And that was another decision that we had to make, was like, how much is too much? With Phil, that conversation was taking place almost continuously to try to find some sensible, fair, common ground where Bill could say what he wanted to say about the 5-year betting partnership, and also make his point about how deeply disappointed he was in Phil for not testifying on his behalf. It took us a while to get to the point where Bill's 100% attitude was, I'm not getting personal here. I'm not going to, this is not a revenge tour, because I thought it would detract from the book. I really did. I thought if you go low in those kinds of situations, and Jeff and I, when we did the Tiger book, we were calculating that all the time. Is like, how much is too much? You know, you want to make a point, but you don't want to pound it to death where people are like putting the book down saying, I can't read any more of this. You want it to be clear. And I think when you talk about and I love the fact is that it's the course of their relationship. It's when they meet for the first time in '06 at the AT&T, and all they do is talk sports on that final Sunday with Freddie Jacobson and the gentleman from the Ford Motor Company. And then they meet again in 2008 at the Wachovia. Phil says, hey, do you do partnerships? And Billy goes, yeah, I do partnerships. You got to have, a house that I can't get to, and you can bet at bigger stakes because people are very conscious of how much I can put down. Phil had both. It was very successful for a long period of time, but then Phil wanted to bet outside the partnership, and Billy, for reasons as he explained in the book, if he's neutral on a game, or he could use Phil's bets to camouflage other bets, they did that. The numbers for Phil from 2010 to 2014, 858 times he bet 220 to win 200, 1,151 times he bet 110 to win 100. That's gross wagers of $311 million alone, just on those two stacks of bets. So 7,000 bets over the course of that 4 or 5 year period, 3,000 plus bets in 1 year, almost 9 a day. So Phil, to his credit, has admitted that he had an addiction. That helped us, because I was very conscious. Look, there's very few people in this book that have the ability. And my thing was always, can we defend it in court?
Right.
If push comes to shove, do we have the documents? Do we have the court records? Do we have the sources? Do we have people that will testify? All those answers were yes, 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 and yes, with not just Phil, but with other prominent people in the book as well. Or almost everybody in the book, because I don't take any of that by chance. But you're right. It was probably the most complicated part of the book, was to decide how far is too far and what's the point here, Bill. And in the end, that last scene with them at Rancho Santa Fe, where Phil, who hasn't talked to Billy in 5 years, never wrote him a letter, never called him when he was in prison, certainly never visited. They're on that, you can't make the scene up. They're on the practice tee and driving range. And, Phil kind of tries to offer an apology, and Billy's a no bullshit guy. And he just says, look, cut the bullshit. I know what you did. I know why you did it. And look, Phil was in a box. I understand that. There was another investigation that he was a part of, in the middle of that money laundering investigation that put Greg Silvera in prison. And he hired Gregory Craig, who was Obama's former chief White House counsel. You talk about juice, political juice. I can't fault Phil for doing what Phil did. He did what was best for Phil. But I was writing Billy Walters' book, not Phil Mickelson's book. And so that's how Bill feels.
Yeah, a lot of those things that you mentioned, their first, kind of time spent together at Pebble Beach in '06, the getting together and Phil saying to him, do you do partnerships? The Wednesday Pro-Am of the Wells Fargo in Charlotte. And what I find, interesting, and Phil, like you said, has admitted to having a gambling addiction that, for all of the gambling that Billy has done in his life, he was the one who exercised the discipline and the responsibility of making it abundantly clear to Phil from the outset, every single wager we make will be done legally. That's the only way I do it. And not that Phil was doing it illegally, but the fact is that Billy had to scold him. And give me the timeline exactly. How far into the partnership did Billy have to say to him, hey, I told you what the rules are, and you're breaking the rules?
Not very far, because Phil he wanted to bet, outside the partnership using some of the games that they were doing. And it doesn't take it takes 5 minutes for Billy Walters to find out if somebody's using his number someplace else. That's just the way his network was. When you have 1,600 accounts around the world and you have the respect that Billy has within the bookmaking establishment, I think that, Billy and Phil, Billy saw Phil as a son, or a younger brother maybe, but more like a son. And he counseled him because, frankly, Bill had been through everything that Phil was going through. He knew, he could see that Phil wanted action. He saw the addiction firsthand, the need to bet multiple games on a single day. And you mentioned Billy, it took Billy a long time for that most important fact, I think, in sports gambling is discipline. You have to decide how much you want to lose. And then in Bill's case, it's different, but for the average bettor, certainly I've said it to family members and I've said it to friends. What's your bankroll? How much do you want to lose? And then Bill's thing is you never bet more than 1 to 3% of your bankroll on any given game. So if it's 10,000, you never bet more than 300 on a game. Well, that just wasn't Phil, and Bill could see that. But he also saw that Phil at the time, how much money is Phil worth? Who knows? But Phil had said, I was worth $250 million at that point in time, $250 million. So Bill's saying, well, if we're betting 20 or 30 million a year together, big deal. He can afford to lose that amount of money because he's got 50 million in endorsement money coming in every year. But Phil, and when Bill said this, and he didn't say it in the book, but he said it subsequently in a lot of the publicity that he's done, is Phil was the biggest bettor he'd ever been around. And I heard that from a intermediary source that was dealing with a major offshore book. And the person that was running that book was named Ron Sacco, who was the biggest bookie in the world. And he said Phil was the biggest bettor he had ever seen in terms of volume and dollars. And that's a pretty powerful statement coming from Ron Sacco. Because, he was doing $1 billion a year in business too through his book. So I think as I said, it's a complicated relationship. There's so much I like about Phil. I think to me, he was the one legitimate, how Tiger was. He was always looking for the next threat. Where was it coming from? Was it going to be VJ? Was it going to be David Duval? Was it going to be Sergio? When Phil showed up with pretty fearless, that's the one that I think that Tiger was the most concerned about. And it elevated his game because he lived for those kinds of competitions.
The story about Phil calling Billy in 2012, just before the Ryder Cup, and suggesting he wanted to lay down a $400,000 wager on the United States to win the Ryder Cup, as you made it very, very clear, it was a phone conversation, and Billy shot him down. And where it went from there, he doesn't know. But the question is, something like that is not only incredibly sensational, but it makes people wonder, my God, how could that be so isolated? That how could that thought from Phil Mickelson exist in that moment? Did his thought about wagering on anything in the game of golf in which he was a participant happen prior or since? Wouldn't that naturally, you think, raise a flag, whether it be the PGA Tour, the PGA of America that runs the Ryder Cup, to do further investigation on that?
Well, you would think, yes. You would think that they would. Look, that's, to me, when Billy said that to me, I almost literally fell out of my chair. I'm like, what? 400,000? And, and I wrote something for the Fire Pit Collective after Phil's denial, which was essentially, I never bet on the Ryder Cup. He did not say, I didn't call Bill Walters and want to bet 400,000. Understood. He came to his senses, I think, thank God, in a lot of ways, because that's not something you ever want to have out there. Witness Pete Rose. And as Billy said, Jesus, you're the Arnold Palmer of golf. What are you doing here? What are you thinking? But it's interesting because we did look at it. There were this is off the top of my head, Gary, it's like 70 something times when Phil was playing in PGA events or events around the world, he was betting heavily on sports. We never saw a golf bet anywhere, ever. Make that perfectly crystal clear.
Yep.
Ever. But, you know, the one example we gave, when he won the AT&T, he had lost $4 million betting college basketball the day before on that Saturday.
Which is an amazing story, because I can just tell you, Armen, as somebody who's covering the event, and he shoots 64 in the final round playing with Tiger. He's playing with Tiger at Pebble, and he shoots 64, and he is in the throes of a bad day gambling on other stuff.
Bad day. Yeah, and I know, and having talked to people that Phil spoke with over that weekend, he was at his wit's end, you know, after losing $4 million. He's like, what in the world am I doing? Well, the next day he goes out and shoots 64 and wins the AT&T, and he beats Tiger by 11. I mean, to me, that's one of the most amazing moments in the whole book. Taking Billy Walters out of the equation, you're like, holy moly. You talk about the ability to separate things in your life, or compartmentalize would be the better word. How do you do that? I mean, and it's not like $4, you know, or $40 or 400,000. It's $4 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money, and I don't care how much you're worth. But then to go out and just dominate on Sunday and win the event, you're like, wow, there's some interesting things going on in that guy's head. That's for sure.
No doubt. Now, you mentioned his unwillingness to testify. There was a call made on Billy's behalf to Phil where he said that he would testify, and then he ultimately did not. But the episode where he goes to pay this debt after he refuses to testify, and upon leaving, Phil says to Billy, you know, I'm going to be around for a couple weeks. Do you want to play golf? Armen, there is, I don't know if it's obtuse. I don't know if it's flakiness. I don't know if it's an absence of compassion. It's maybe all of those things. How could Phil Mickelson, who has an understanding of a lot of things, maybe he thinks he knows more about a lot of things than he actually does, but come on, there's an absence of humanity there that is unimaginable.
Narcissism. You know, I mean, I was like, when Billy told me that story, I originally wanted to open the book with that story because I just thought it spoke volumes about both puts Bill in a very, and I've sat on that patio. Bill has since sold that house and bought another house in Rancho Santa Fe. But I sat where they sat on that deck overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And all I can, you know, I'll still remember to this day, Billy and I talking about it, having lunch and talking to each other. And I'm like, okay, let's go over this one more time. You know, let's get granular here, because what did you say to him? What did he say to you? Put me inside your head. And he's still got that ankle bracelet on. He's going to prison. You know, he just got convicted on 10 charges, 10 counts of insider trading. He's facing God knows how many years in prison. He thinks Phil's coming there to settle this debt, which he is. It's $2.5 million. Bets outside their partnership that he owed, because they always settled around the $3 million mark. And I said, well, what did he say? And he's like, all he was doing was talking about himself and about, I lost my ExxonMobil sponsorship, and I lost my Barclays sponsorship, and I had to take a 30% cut on my KPMG, and my private plane has been depreciated by X millions of dollars. And Billy's thinking, I can't believe what's come out of this guy's mouth. But if you know Phil, and you do know Phil, I mean, how many times have you heard the words, you know, he thinks he's the smartest guy in every room, whether he's the smartest guy in every room or not. And I think there's a lot of that there, that narcissism, that lack of empathy and humanity for other people. It's like, you got to be kidding me here. But to me, it was a very powerful scene, because Bill's, as he said, if I could buy my way out of this partnership right now, there's no amount of money I wouldn't pay. So yeah, those are the kinds of things when you're looking for One of the, not to diverse too much, but the thing that makes 60 Minutes so successful and those stories so good is we were always looking for moments in the interviews. You string those moments together in a very cohesive, powerful, compelling way, and you get a 60 Minutes piece. Those interviews, everything is based around those interviews. If you can interview and you create those moments, often they're spontaneous when someone says something and you go, oh, I wasn't going to ask that till later, but now you know what it's like. Do you ask it in that moment? Well, I knew moments, so I know that's a moment. That's a moment that's going in the book. The book is, in so many ways, it's a series of moments in Bill's life strung together over the course of 28 chapters that really give you a 360-degree view of a man's life. And that's really all I was, not all, but that was the main focus of what I was trying to do is like, who is Billy Walters? And, why do I care about this guy?
A few other things here. You go into reading something like this and, I'm not trying to be for or against one person or the other, but I didn't have any earthly idea about the dubious nature of the behavior and the conduct of the Department of Justice and the FBI and these things around this investigation. It's beyond extraordinary. And I set that up by then asking this question. It doesn't appear to me that Phil Mickelson would have been exposing himself in any way, even though the money laundering case was out there on the periphery, and I'm sure it was center in his mind, had he just gone in there and all Billy was asking him was to just tell the truth, that these conversations
or just
we
make
had.
A public statement, Gary,
That's it.
He didn't even have to show up in New York. All you had to do is, Phil made some public statements about Billy, including at the memorial after Billy was convicted.
Yes.
I read that press conference. I pulled it up and word for word in the book where Phil is basically dancing on Billy's grave a little bit, saying, oh, I have to be more careful about the people I associate with. Really? Okay. The same person that had associated with the Saudis? We can go, and the same person that associated with Dandy Don De Serrano, one of the biggest bookies and organized crime figures in Detroit. We could go on with some of the dubious associations that Phil had and has had. To me, as the investigative journalist, the Southern District of New York, to me, that chapter, 60 Minutes to 5 years, that was originally 3 chapters that got compressed, wisely so. I think our editor, Jofi Ferrari Adler, did it. It was one of his really astute observations. Guys, this is great, but we got to cut it down and make it faster. And we did. I did, and other people helped. But it was more, I have that ex parte letter that Preet Bharara sent to Judge Castell, where the government, the Southern District of New York, the Justice Department admitted that a senior supervisory agent of the FBI, David Chavez, repeatedly, by my count, at least 13 times, met privately and secretly with reporters from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times to feed them secret grand jury testimony, which is a cardinal sin in the court of law, in the court of justice. I would call the chapter Southern Injustice. That would be my name for it, because clearly, after Billy and the computer group beat the FBI in that famous trial in Vegas in the early 90s, he had a target on his back from the Justice Department. And when he made a self-admitted mistake of saying some things in a 60 Minutes interview about, Tyco and some of the other WorldCom and some of the other businesses that were nothing more than frauds, cost Billy $12 million in stock in those companies. He said some things publicly on 60 about swindlers and thieves that set the SEC after him. And when you at one point in time, he's being investigated by the FBI, the Southern District of New York, the IRS, and the SEC. I don't know about you. I don't want one of those investigating me, let alone four of them. But that was Billy. They wanted Billy. He had a target on his back. And in the end, I won't go into chapter and verse in the book, but they used one guy's word who had his own set of problems, Tom Davis, 29 different times he had to speak with the government to get his story straight. You got to be kidding me, right? And I think had Phil, to go back to Phil, had Phil shown up in New York, the power of his personality and his credibility with the public, Billy believes would have turned the tide in his favor with the jurors. And for reasons that are self-explanatory in the book, Phil made a very conscious decision not to do that. That fractured a friendship that will never be repaired.
The top of page 308, I'm just going to read this to kind of finish up on Phil. Billy wrote, looking back, I realized there's a common denominator in many of Phil's long-term relationships, be it 30 years playing on the PGA Tour, 25 years working with Jim Bones Mackay, 17 years betting with Greg Silveria, or 5 years gambling with me. When push comes to shove, Phil doesn't care about anyone except himself. Time and time again, he never stood up for a friend. He refused to simply tell the truth when it could have meant the difference between prison and exoneration. There's a self-preservation to that, Armen, that again, self-preservation and narcissism is like affirmed in Aladar. I mean, they're always running neck and neck. And there's a duplicity to Phil, like all the autographs and all of the generosity. And I was recently with Butch Harmon, and he talked about these incredibly generous things he's done for him. And then there's the counter to it. And like you said, he's a fascinating study, but there's a complexity to it that would take a lot of time to try to fully understand.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You picked out, it's amazing that, how long did it take you, Gary, to read it? Maybe 40 seconds. I can't tell you how much time and effort went into coming to that conclusion. And then not just Bill, but the individuals that are mentioned there, I've had relationships with over the course of the last 3, 4, or 5 years in various ways, shapes, or forms. And no, that was a recurring theme in all of those relationships. Was first and foremost, it was Phil. And to me, when Billy said that, I was like, okay, that's the icing on the cake for us. That's how I really feel about my relationship with Phil. Push comes to shove, in the end, it's going to be about Phil. And I'm far from I'm the last person probably that should be sitting around telling people how to live their life. And then you just have to be careful when you get into those kinds of circumstances to not sound like a hypocrite on your end. But I think that really sums up how Bill Walters feels about Phil Mickelson. Push comes to shove, it was going to be about Phil, and it was not going to be about Bill.
The book has so much in it. I could talk to you at great length about, the expertise associated with legalized gambling, where we are today in our society with the acceptance of it, out of the shadows after forever, in terms of Vegas now being basically the American epicenter for the sporting enterprises that we have in this country, alcoholism, recovery. This is a book about not only, like you said, a uniquely American life, it's also about survival.
Yes.
And success. And it's interesting. I'll end it with this. The death of his friend Fred Ferris was the impetus for him to really do his first real introspective examination of, okay, smoking, alcohol, this is killing me, and that he was able to stop cold turkey. As somebody who's trying to live a life of sobriety every day myself, I laughed out loud when he said, I thought alcoholics were people who drank, every day and couldn't stop. And it's one of a million different rationalizations that alcoholics give until they're ready to do the only thing that's going to save their life, and that is surrender. So, look, this book is so entertaining, so interesting, and so thorough about talking about this man's life, which also includes gambling at the game of golf, which, let me end with this as I'm filibustering here. The fact that professional gamblers invitational, they eliminated all rules of golf except
Isn't
one.
that the best?
Except
Yeah.
one. When you find your damn ball, you play it as it lies. Like,
Isn't that the best?
Armen, at the essence of all the impropriety associated with trying to get any advantage you
put grease
can.
on your clubs. You can change somebody's lie. You can do anything. You could actually slip somebody a Mickey and nobody would give a shit. But no, if it's on the top of a ball washer, that's where you play it. And that's the beauty of it. I mean, I had so much fun talking to guys like Jack Binion and Billy Baxter and Dewey Tomko and Gene McCarley, who tells this great story. We didn't even talk about it, but I won't give it away, about a black swan and playing with Billy for $100. And it was like they were playing for 100,000. You play it where it lays. And that's a perfect example of no. It's right here on top of the swan dump, right? So, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I'm really proud of where the book is. It's got great reviews, and when you spend as much time as both Bill and I did, and there's another guy, Dave Satterfield, who worked on the betting chapters, Glenn Bunning, who was really close with the editing on this. All of us spent an inordinate amount of time trying to make this book really special, and I think it works on a lot of different levels, not only as a sports book and as a sports betting book and a golf book, but it really works on the personal level, which is what I was really after. So thank you for saying that.
Well, and I'll just indulge me just one step further. I've never had a chance to share this with you. Of all the conversations I've had about the Tiger book with people, and I understand, like, gosh, it's just, it's peeling back so much of it. I'm like, you don't understand. Like, he was more, to me anyway, and your goal is to try to be first truthful, to be as fair as you possibly can in the collaboration you and Jeff did. He was more endearing. At the end, the compassion
kidding.
I felt for him
Thank you.
was immeasurable.
Thank you. We made Tiger understandable and empathetic in the end, because you appreciate in so many ways so much of what happened to him was out of his control. Now, there were times when he was out of control himself, but in the end, it's you feel sorry for Tiger in some way, shape, or form. And trust me, there were periods of time when Jeff and I were writing that book, before we got to the end, before Tiger won at Eastlake, and before, just the moments with the Masters and everything else, we're like, he's getting kind of hard to like here, But then I saw him in January, right before the book came out in 2018, at Torrey, and he was different. He was more engaged. I was like, oh my God, I think there's hope here. And then there was. And so thank you for saying that, because I think, and Tiger and I have never talked about the book, and I doubt we ever will. But if he ever said anything to me, I would say to him, you know what? You should feel lucky that it was Jeff and I that did this book, because you came out of this a much more endearing person than when we started. And, yes, warts and all, not really, because we made conscious decisions not to go to certain places in Tiger's life, because, again, you're trying to balance what are we trying to do here? I'm not into writing salacious, sensational. I'm not going to spend 3 years of my life to write a book. If I wanted to be sensational about Tiger, I could have done it in a year, not 3 years. To understand him took us 3 years. And that was the same way with Billy. In order to write from a position of strength, you have to understand, you have to kind of get inside that person's head. And I will never say I was inside Tiger's head, but I certainly, I think I go back to what the two things that drew us to the book. Who is Tiger Woods, and what's the price of genius? And the price of genius is what was really driving the storytelling, because there is a price, and Tiger paid it. But in the end, you're like, oh my God. When he hugs Charlie, or he's hugging his family members, or you think about that hug he had with his dad after the Masters in '97, then you think about the hug with Charlie, you're like, oh my God, okay, this is a great father. And in the end, if you get to that point, boy, I'll tell you something, being a great father and a great husband I'll put that at the top of my list any day.
No question. You use the word genius. In the history of mankind, genius is not without being messy. Genius is not pretty. It's genius, and it's complicated. And I congratulate you and Jeff on that. And presently, this book right here is awfully, awfully good. I know it, like you said, 7,000 hours. It's a lot of hours. It's a lot of time, and it shows in the work. Thank you for taking the time to spend with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, as you can see, at least I hope you can see, and in hearing, this is an amazing life, but the story of how Billy Walters wound up in jail is beyond dubious. And it's not just the absence of Phil Mickelson making a public statement or not testifying on his behalf. The government and the FBI, a lot of it. And the fact that this man in his mid-70s came out of jail and didn't just throw flamethrowers at everybody and just wrote a book that is complete and in total in examining and telling his story of his life. Pretty amazing. I appreciate Armen Keteyian. Most importantly, appreciate all of you out there for listening and watching to this Five Clubs conversation. We'll see you next week.